Okay, so far we've looked at the origins of Afghan conflict with the British in 1839, with the toppling of the King of Afghanistan in 1973 by pro-Soviet forces, and then the Soviet intervention in 1979, and that's followed with the American defeat of the Soviet forces in 1989, the toppling of the Soviet regime in 1992, then the 1996, the rise of the Taliban. And the Taliban, Talib of course means student, so the students of the madrasas, they poured over the border from Pakistan, funded by the Saudis, and they took power. The way they did it was there was very little fighting. They simply offered money and the local forces defected. That's what's happening now. That's how you capture 17 provinces in 7 days. You don't fight. You say, look, you're Afghans, we're Afghans. You're Muslims, we're Muslims. Why are we fighting each other? On behalf of the foreigner who is now running away. The Russians ran away in 1989 and their regime lasted 3 years. The Americans haven't even left yet. They're living on the 11th of September, so they've still got a couple of weeks, but the whole House of Cards is collapsing. Now, people have compared this to Afghanistan, to Saigon in 1975, and it's very accurate. There's a difference in the way people train. Now, the British have never had this happen. The British had 49 colonies. They never got chased out of any of them. They fought bitterly from 1776 to 1783 to retain the largest ever colony, North America. They retreated into Canada, which became British North America. So the British always set up in place a stable government. They gave them a prime minister, they gave them a parliament, they went through a whole series of transitions. There was autonomy, there was self-governance, and that happened with each of the colonies that made up the 6 colonies in Australia, the landmass of Australia, which later formed into a federation. But before they were each given independence, one after the other, starting with Victoria in 1849, then Queensland in 1859. So the British waited years, and there were certain hurdles you had to get over. You had to show you were worthy of autonomy, you had to show you were worthy of self-government, you had responsible everything. Tax collection, the whole thing. The British were empire builders and they were nation builders. Now America went into Iraq and said, we're not nation builders, we're not doing nation building, says George Bush. They go into Afghanistan and say, oh, we're not doing nation building. Well, okay, so you pay your armed forces, they run around shooting everybody. You have torture centres, places like Bagram. You have extraordinary rendition. You torture people, you assassinate people. You take 600 people who have no charges against them at all, but they're locked up in Guantanamo Bay for, since when? 2001, 20 years jail for nothing. Now they're afraid to let them go. They say, oh yes, they weren't terrorists when they arrived, but they certainly are now. No one's game to touch them. So there are hundreds of people trapped in Guantanamo, probably forever. Probably until they die, simply because the Americans precipitately acted. There's records that Taliban were captured, and their taxi driver, he's taken too. So a lot of taxi drivers sitting around Guantanamo Bay for just taking a fare. That's America. So what happened in 1996? Well, the Taliban took over all of Afghanistan. They bribed their way through, but they got to the Panjshir Valley, which had always resisted Russian intrusion, and it was run by a fellow called Shah Ahmad Massoud, the Lion of the Panjshir, and the Taliban couldn't get in. It was invincible, impregnable fortress valley, and they had defeated the Russians multiple times, and the Taliban couldn't get in. So for 5 years it was a holdout. It was only 5% of the population territory of Afghanistan, but the Americans recognized them as the government, not the 95% Taliban. So there are only 3 countries in the world, and Saudi was one of them, who recognised the Taliban government. So the Americans started saying terrible things about the Taliban. It's proven in 1998, the Taliban offered to hand over OBL, who was hiding out there, to the Americans. There's video footage. The CIA met them on the border at Peshawar, the crossing point, and the Taliban said, look, we'll hand him over, just don't attack us. And they went back to White House, and Bill Clinton said, no, don't do it. So instead, they chased OBL out of Afghanistan. They chased him to Sudan. Then the Americans launched missiles against Sudan. They launched missiles against Afghanistan. That's why the Taliban chased him out. But they'd given an opportunity to hand him over, and the Americans refused it. Now, why? 3 years later, they use him as an excuse to invade Afghanistan. So there's footage of all this. There's things going on behind the scenes. Once again, we've got a sort of shadow war going on. There are dark forces. We don't know what their real goals are, but it's certainly not national defence or the national interest or the public interest. So the Taliban control 95% of the country, but only 3 countries are allowed to recognise them. The Americans have stopped anybody else from recognising them. Now, a similar situation happened in 1975 to 1979. The Khmer Rouge took over in Cambodia. Australia, Britain, and a lot of countries recognised the Khmer Rouge as the government of Cambodia. Now, at the time, we were told it's because Britain and America use different criteria. The Americans recognise the regime if they like them. The British and Australians and other Commonwealth countries, we recognise, they use a very simple method. The British walk in, they say, okay, who's running the shop? And whoever is the boss, they recognise them as the government. It doesn't matter whether they like them or not. And China does a very similar thing today. They don't hold anyone's human rights record or anything. They say, are you in control of this country? Good, then we recognise you as the government. America does the opposite. They recognised people living in Thai refugee camps as the government of Cambodia. They recognised this Panjshir Valley warlord as the government of Afghanistan, and on his behalf he asked the Americans to invade, so they invaded, and they kicked out the people who are running 95% of the country, which is the Taliban. So that's the sort of lopsided illogic that the Americans practice, and it gets them into so much trouble. How on earth could you recognise a guy who runs 5% of the country? But they've done it time and time again. So this is what's happened, and the Americans managed to hold down the Taliban for 20 years, but they never pacified the country. And there's all these books that we looked at in the first episode explain the people in the Panjshir Valley were different ethnically to the Pashtun majority, who the Taliban represent. The Panjshir Valley Northern Alliance, as they called themselves, they were the Tajiks. There was another mob called the Uzbeks, led by Dostan, General Dostan. He's a mercenary. He had his own Uzbek unit. They fought they fought on behalf of the Russian army and the Russian regime. It was only in '92 they got bribed to defect, and that's when the pro-Russian regime collapsed. Dostan became a warlord in Mazar-e-Sharif. Apparently his stronghold has just fallen as well. So what does the future hold? Well, we go back to the situation where the Iranians are saying they're going to try and hold down the border, according to a strategy paper, which I've never seen before. I don't know what the credibility is there, but they did have a legion, an Afghan legion in Syria. Now, according to this argument, what happened was the Syrians were under threat in 2014. So this is divergence. This is how we're linking all these wars together. The Americans are undermining regimes. In 2011, they launched a thing called the Arab Spring. It was an attempt, as General Wesley Clark said just before this, I've seen a secret plan. He said at a conference, and it's on videotape, check out the internet, General Wesley Clark, he was Commander-in-Chief of NATO. He ran for President in the United States. Not sure which party. He lost out in the primaries very quickly. He said, I've seen a plan whereby we are going to knock out 7 countries. And he named them: Libya, Iran, Syria, Yemen, all these countries that were hostile to America, allegedly hostile. And they've knocked out every single one. 6 of the 7 got knocked out. They murdered the dictator of Libya, they murdered the dictator of Iraq, and left ruins in their place. Chaos. Tens of thousands, even millions, it's been alleged millions have died in Iraq. From the war, the chaos, the bloodshed, the bestiality, the horror. And the Americans did this deliberately, and Wesley Clark predicted it would happen, and that's possibly why, because of his big mouth, why he lost out in the primaries. General Petraeus, who was successful in Iraq in 2007, he also stood for president, and he was undermined straight away. He was knocked out by a sex scandal. And of course, Mario Cuomo, who killed thousands of people recently in New York due to his neglect, after bringing down Trump, he's just been toppled in a sex scandal a couple of weeks ago. This is August 2021. So he's been brought down by an alleged sex scandal. So this is the way you get rid of leaders who have served their purpose or are inconvenient or a little bit too truthful. So Petraeus was pulled down by a sex scandal. Cuomo's pulled down by a sex scandal. Who knows who's next? They tried to do it with Trump, but Trump boasted of it. Hey, sex scandal? Yeah, sure, I got the tapes. So he's a person you couldn't undermine because he was completely amoral. So the usual tactics didn't work on him. What's the future bring? Well, if these 50,000 Afghans can stabilise Western Afghanistan, they'll be a force to be reckoned with. They represent the Shias, who are 20% of the population. We hope that Iran will be able to re-establish a Persian Empire. That will mean Biden will have to go completely gaga in office and lose control of the situation. Democrats have a tendency, and you'll notice this with Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, they focus on the domestic policy, welfareism, buying votes. The Republicans tend to be better at foreign policy, but not so good at domestic policy, which always undoes them. And that's why they have this revolving door, Republican, Democrat. One does well on the outside, but not on the inside. One does well on the inside, but not on the outside. So we can only hope that 4 years of Biden, Iran, Persia will be able to re-establish their hold over the Middle East, which they held for hundreds of years until that silly person, Alexander the Great, toppled them in 313. And they're still singing songs. You can see it on videos. They're still singing songs, Iskander, Iskander, and Iran, why did you destroy our empire? Because he left nothing in its place. There were 4 rival kingdoms who fought each other for hundreds of years. So why did they destroy the Persian Empire and its greatness? And Persia deserves to have an empire. They are a great civilization. They are thousands of years old. They have culture, they have music, they have arts, they have drama. Everything the American infidel lacks. Let's all pray to Jesus Christ and every idol, anything you worship, pray to it, that the Persians are victorious and that America will disappear into the dust of history. This will be the greatest outcome. This will be Biden's Vietnam. He won't even remember it, which is great. End of vlogs.